What would you do if someone looked you in the eye and said, "Sir, the seat isn't meant for people like you"? Would you walk away quietly? Would you fight back? Or would you rise in silence and change the entire system? On a routine flight from Chicago to Los Angeles, Julian Mercer, a calm yet commanding tech CEO, takes his assigned first-class seat. But what should have been a simple moment of boarding turns into something far more disturbing. A flight attendant questions his place. A supervisor sides with privilege. A wealthy passenger demands her usual seat. And just like that, the stage is set. What they didn't know, Julian isn't just another passenger. And this seat, it's about more than comfort. It's about justice. This is not just a story about being denied a seat. It's a story about reclaiming space, about confronting bias, about quiet power refusing to bow, and it all happened at 30,000 feet. Before we dive in, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, because stories like this, they need to be seen, and they need to be remembered. Now, let's begin. The hum of jet engines blended softly with the rustle of jackets and the occasional chime from an overhead speaker. Etheria Flight 309 sat gleaming at Gate C-18 of Chicago O'Hare, prepped for its direct flight to Los Angeles. First class had begun boarding, and the energy in the cabin was peaceful, structured, professional, just the way it always was. Julian Mercer stepped aboard with quiet confidence. His suit, deep navy with a subtle textured weave, fit perfectly. A silver watch peeked from beneath his cuff, ticking with gentle rhythm. He didn't glance around nervously like some travelers did when stepping into luxury. He moved with the ease of someone who belonged, though, in truth, he'd spent years being told otherwise. He gave a polite nod to the attendant near the entrance and moved toward seat 1A. His assigned spot window side, first row, the seat was spacious, trimmed in cream leather with brushed metal accents. He placed his carry-on in the overhead bin, then retrieved a hardcover journal and a slim leather folio. As he eased into the seat, the cabin still mostly empty, he let out a quiet breath. Across the aisle, another passenger settled in, nodding briefly at Julian before adjusting his earbuds. Everything was routine until it wasn't. A soft voice spoke from above him, polite, crisp, with something cool beneath the surface. "Excuse me, sir," said Darla Reese, the lead flight attendant. "I believe you may be in the wrong seat." Julian looked up. She wore the signature deep teal Etheria Airlines uniform, pressed to perfection. Her posture was professional, her expression unreadable. But Julian had spent a lifetime reading expressions. He could spot a mask in seconds. "No," he said calmly. "This is 1A. That's what's on my boarding pass." He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and handed it to her. Darla took it, eyes scanning briefly. She smiled politely, too politely. "I see," she said. "It's just that, well, this seat is usually reserved for Ms. Harrington. She's one of our most frequent flyers and always requests this seat in particular." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Are seats assigned by tradition or by ticket?" he asked. His voice was low, even, not rude, not defensive, just firm. Darla hesitated. "Of course by ticket, sir. It's just that this may be a misunderstanding. I'd be happy to reseat you in 2D. It's also first class and very comfortable." Julian didn't move, didn't shift, didn't blink. "I prefer to stay in the seat I paid for." A subtle pause, a flicker in her eyes. He knew this rhythm, the suggestion. The sidestep. The offer that's not really an offer, but a push wrapped in courtesy. He'd seen it at the golf club years ago when a waiter asked if he was meeting someone as he walked toward the members' lounge. He'd seen it in boardrooms when he was asked if he was part of the tech team before he presented as CEO. And now, here it was again. The cabin grew slightly quieter. Darla's voice was still smooth. "Sir, I'm sure you understand, as Harrington always sits here. It's her preferred arrangement." Julian leaned back. "I'm sure Ms. Harrington will understand that I have a confirmed seat assignment." 1A. Darla opened her mouth, but another voice interjected. "I always sit there." Sloane Harrington had boarded unnoticed, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted floor. She was tall, dressed in cream slacks and a champagne blouse with a designer scarf knotted loosely around her neck. Her tone wasn't hostile, but it carried entitlement like perfume. Julian turned his head calmly. "I'm sure you're used to it," he said, "but today, it's not your seat." Sloane blinked as if the concept hadn't registered. She looked at Darla, who offered a helpless expression in return. "I can have Mr. Mercer moved," Darla whispered. "No," Julian said, louder this time. "You can't." Other passengers began glancing over. Connor Maddox, the cabin supervisor, entered from the galley. He was tall, square-jawed, and already annoyed. He barely looked at Julian before addressing Darla. "Problem, Mr. Mercer refuses to switch seats." Connor sighed. "Sir, we can offer you another seat, one with even more privacy." Julian's jaw tensed. "Why would I want privacy for doing nothing wrong?" Connor's tone cooled. "We'd appreciate your cooperation." Julian nodded slightly, "and I'd appreciate being treated like a paying customer instead of a placeholder." The aisle was still. A beat passed. Then click. Somewhere behind him, a passenger raised their phone and began filming quietly. Another did the same from a few rows back. Julian noticed but didn't react. He didn't need to. He looked up at Darla. "Is it Etheria policy to displace a passenger for the comfort of someone else?" Darla hesitated. Connor didn't. "We're asking you to cooperate for the sake of cabin harmony." A quiet scoff from a few rows back. Tension rippled like a current. Julian rose not to leave, but to stand. He straightened the lapel of his blazer. His voice was quiet, but clear. "You may not realize it now, but this is the moment the narrative changes." He looked Connor in the eye. "I won't be moved." The quiet grew louder. Not one voice rose in his defense. Not yet, but the story had already begun, and seat 1A would soon mean something far bigger than just a number stitched into leather. Julian remained standing. His calm was intact, but behind his eyes, a storm was forming, not of rage, not even defiance, but of memory, deep memory. He had stood before, in rooms where no one believed he was in charge, in hotel lobbies where staff offered him valet tickets without asking, in investment meetings where junior analysts addressed his assistant instead of him, and now, on a luxury aircraft. He was standing again, not because he didn't belong, but because someone had decided he didn't look like he belonged. Across the aisle, Sloane Harrington adjusted her designer scarf with a scoff. "This is just absurd," she muttered, clearly loud enough for others to hear. "Some people don't understand how things work." Julian said nothing. His eyes flicked to Darla Reese. The flight attendant was no longer smiling. Her jaw was tight. The mask of corporate civility had started to crack. "Mr. Mercer," she said, with deliberate formality, We are offering you a comparable seat in 3C. It's still first class, just a bit further from the front," Connor Maddox added. "It's a private pod, actually. More leg room, same service." Julian tilted his head slightly, and yet not the seat I paid for. Connor's tone shifted. "You're making this difficult." A pause. "I'm not making anything," Julian replied. "I'm simply sitting in my assigned seat. You're the ones creating a conflict." The air in the cabin grew noticeably colder, not in temperature but in tone. Some passengers looked away. Others began watching more openly, their phones tilted subtly toward the scene. Julian caught sight of a young man a few rows back, Asian, early 30s, filming quietly. Their eyes met briefly. No words passed, but something flickered, a quiet understanding. Julian sat down again, deliberately. He placed his leather folio in his lap. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "Unless there's a safety issue or a procedural violation, I will remain here." Darla took a breath as if to reply, but before she could speak, Connor leaned in and said softly, "Then we'll have to involve security." That word, security. Julian felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the unspoken escalation, the shift from conversation to containment, the invisible line that people like him had crossed too many times just by existing in the wrong place. 1,000 thoughts moved through him in a second. He could leave, avoid the scene, take the seat in 3C and let it go. He could get off the plane entirely and rebook, fly private, call his office, have Marina handle it, chalk it up to just another insult on a long list. But then, what? What changed? If he stepped aside now, would Darla ever question her assumptions? Would Connor think twice the next time? Would the boy with the phone stop filming, or would he turn away like so many others? Julian looked out the window. The tarmac stretched beneath them, sunlight shimmering off the wingtip. Somewhere beyond that, Los Angeles waited, but so did something else. A line in the sand. He turned back toward Darla. "I'll wait." Connor shook his head and walked briskly toward the front of the cabin. Darla followed, muttering something into her service phone. Moments later, the forward galley curtain parted again. 2 security officers stepped onto the plane. They weren't TSA, not airport police, just uniformed aviation security contracted by the airline to handle disruptions. The taller one spoke first. "Mr. Mercer, we'd like to speak with you outside the aircraft." Julian rose slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't resist. He picked up his folio, adjusted his jacket, and stepped into the aisle. As he walked toward the exit, he felt the weight of dozens of eyes, some sympathetic, some indifferent, some even irritated by the delay. Not one spoke up. Not one said, "This isn't right," except for the faint sound of a phone still recording. At the aircraft door, the taller officer paused. "Sir, we're just escorting you to the gate area. No charges, no report, just a seat reassignment." Julian nodded silently. Inside, Darla's voice returned, now brighter, more cheerful as she welcomed Sloane to seat 1A. Connor resumed his place by the front galley, arms crossed, expression unreadable, and Julian walked down the jet bridge with security beside him, carrying only his dignity and a decision he had already made. The terminal was colder than the cabin. Or maybe it just felt that way now. Julian moved away from the gate area and found a quiet corner near a row of power outlets. He placed his folio down on the bench and sat slowly. For the first time in a long time, He let the emotion rise not to the surface, but close enough to feel. He wasn't embarrassed. That wasn't it. He was exhausted. Exhausted from decades of having to explain his existence, from being overqualified and still questioned, from having the money, the status, the credentials, but never the assumed legitimacy. He leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. Then he pulled out his phone, he opened the camera, and he hit record. My name is Julian Mercer. I was removed from my assigned first-class seat aboard Etheria Flight 309, despite holding a valid boarding pass and platinum executive status. I was told the seat was not available because it is usually taken by another passenger. I was not disruptive. I did not argue. I was removed because someone believed I did not belong. He paused. This video serves as documentation, not for sympathy but for truth. As he stopped the recording, a voice spoke beside him. "Excuse me." Julian turned. The man from the plane, the one recording, stood nearby. He looked nervous. His phone was in his hand. "I saw what happened." He said, "I was in seat 3D. My name's Caleb." Julian nodded once. "I recorded the whole thing. From when she asked you to move, to when you walked off, and I caught something else too." He opened his phone and pulled up a video in the frame. Moments before Julian had stood, Sloane Harrington was visible leaning toward Connor. Her hand moved subtly into his jacket pocket. Her lips moved, but no sound. "I thought it was weird at the time," Caleb said, "but now it's pretty clear." Julian watched the clip in silence. When it ended, he nodded again. "Can you send that to me?" "Of course, and I'll keep a copy." Caleb's voice shook. What they did, it was wrong. "If you need someone to speak up publicly, I will." Julian met his gaze. He saw sincerity. He saw courage still forming. And he saw something rare. Allyship. "Thank you," Julian said. "Please don't delete it. This story isn't over yet." As Caleb left, Julian opened his contacts. He called Marina Shu. "It's begun," he said. "Activate response protocol 1. There was a pause. Then her voice, steady as always, came through the line. "I'm on it." Julian stood. He wasn't angry. He wasn't ashamed. He was ready. And somewhere back at gate C-18, someone still thought they'd won. They had no idea what they'd just started. Julian stood in the corner of Terminal C, the wall cool against his back. He didn't pace. He didn't check his watch. He waited with the stillness of someone who had been here before, not in this exact place, but in this space between dignity and dismissal. On the line, Marina Shu's voice remained steady. "We've confirmed your boarding pass was valid. First class, seat 1A, paid in full via corporate platinum account," she said. "We also have your loyalty tier flagged as Emerald Executive with Etheria, top 1%. Julian closed his eyes, just for a moment. "All that," he murmured, and still, "Sir, this seat isn't for you." He opened them again. Marina continued. "I've reached out to Naomi. She's on standby with legal. Should I begin media tracking?" "Yes," Julian replied, "and flag Caleb's footage for legal review. We'll need confirmation on the bribe. Already sent. Connor Maddock shows up in a previous employee complaint file, too. Racial profiling at gate check-in 2 years ago. Never formally investigated." Of course he did. Julian didn't sigh. He had no time for it. Not today. A subtle buzz hit his phone, an alert from OmniSite's proprietary media AI system. The video was already posted. 3,000 views, then 12,000, then 30, and growing. Without a single press release, The story was already airborne. He headed toward a quiet lounge. Not the exclusive members one, not today. Today, he wanted to see the regular travelers, the families, the solo flyers, the ones like him, who didn't get warning before the world shifted beneath their feet. As he moved through the terminal, another notification flashed across his screen. Jonas seat. A hour flying, while black, etheria discrimination trending. One video, one witness, one truth caught on camera. And now the world was watching. Back on board, Flight 309 Sloane Harrington reclined into her newly secured seat 1A, smiling with subtle satisfaction. She reached for her Perrier, which Darla handed her with a whisper of deference. "I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience," Darla said. "Oh, don't worry, dear," Sloane replied. "You handled it perfectly. Some people just don't understand protocols." A few rows back, someone coughed, as if choking on the word. Connor Maddox stood at the galley entrance, watching silently. He didn't look victorious. He looked unsettled. The first ripples of consequence always arrived as discomfort before they ever resembled regret. Still, he said nothing. The plane door closed. They thought it was over. At the same time, Julian entered a corner of the lounge and sat at a low table. The news was already up on CNN's digital feed. The headline was small, buried between political analysis and sports recaps. But it was there. Black CEO removed from first-class seat. Airline faces scrutiny. He didn't care for the headline. He cared about the footage. He tapped it open. There he was, calm, steady, declining to move, and there she was, Sloane, reaching subtly into Connor's jacket. That image alone would tell the story better than 1,000 angry posts. A woman across from him, maybe mid-50s, was watching the same video. She glanced up, their eyes met, and this time, for once, someone said something. "That was you," she said softly. "I'm sorry. What they did was disgusting." Julian didn't respond at first. Then he offered a quiet nod. "Thank you." He didn't need more. He just needed the silence to break, even in whispers. 10 minutes later, he was seated in a secure media room near the executive concourse. Etheria had one. Like most major airlines, it was designed for high-level passengers and board members to take press calls, connect during delays, or issue emergency statements. Julian wasn't there to issue a statement. Not yet. He connected to the encrypted video server Marina had activated. Naomi Reyes appeared on screen first. Civil rights attorney, razor-sharp mind, unshakable. The kind of legal weapon built not for vengeance but for systemic rupture. "Julian," she greeted, expression taut with purpose. "I've reviewed the footage. It's actionable. We have enough to pursue civil litigation, potentially federal, if we uncover pattern behavior." Julian nodded. Marina mentioned an old complaint. "Yes, we're tracking 3 others involving Connor Maddox, all minorities, all seat-related, all buried quietly by HR." Julian's expression remained neutral. But inside, another cable of resolve locked into place. "This wasn't about a seat," he said. "It was about expectation." Naomi understood. Marina joined the call. "Julian, you still want the board briefing set for noon?" "Yes, and prep the emergency shareholder vote. I'll invoke clause B17.5. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "That's the clause for I know what it's for." Julian cut in gently. "It's time." Clause B17.5 was rarely used. It gave Julian, as primary strategic stakeholder in multiple transportation alliances, authority to freeze Omnisite's tech rollout across partner brands including Etheria. They had signed him for a $75 million systems upgrade contract, AI-driven scheduling, equity alert tools, predictive maintenance, but they hadn't realized the man they pushed out of seat 1A also held the keys to the very infrastructure they hoped would modernize their brand. They hadn't just insulted a passenger, they had sabotaged their future. Elsewhere, in Etheria's 20th floor executive boardroom, the scramble had begun. Screens lit up with news headlines. Legal aides reviewed the video, growing paler with every frame. PR leads drafted talking points. Compliance officers dug into customer complaint logs. Richard Hanover, CEO of Etheria Airlines, sat at the head of the table, fists clenched around his coffee cup. "Get me Darla's statement," he said, "and who the hell is Connor Maddox?" One of the assistants replied hesitantly, "Cabin supervisor, long tenure, 2 quiet HR flags. Should have been 3, someone muttered. A silence fell. Hanover tapped the table once. "Julian Mercer. That name, he's Omnisite's CEO. "Right." Another nod, "And he's our contract lead on the AI system." Another nod, this one slower. Guilt-ridden. Hanover stood abruptly. "Clear my afternoon. Prep for a board-level call. And for God's sake, get that damn video off the front page." Too late. The clip had hit 2.4 million views by then, and counting. Back in the media room, Julian sat alone. But he didn't feel alone, not anymore. Marina's message popped on his screen. "Legal green lit. Press is lining up. Should we move?" Julian thought for a moment. He looked down at his hands. Steady, calm, as always. But inside, a tide had turned. He wasn't angry. He was ready. Ready for the boardroom. Ready for the vote. Ready for the reckoning. The kind that doesn't ask for an apology because it requires accountability. And this time, he wasn't walking away. He was walking back in, with leverage and with millions watching. The glass doors of Etheria's executive terminal slid open with a hush as Julian Mercer walked in, flanked by 2 people who moved like calm shadows beside him. Marina Shu, precise in her gray-tailored suit, and Naomi Reyes, power wrapped in quiet composure. No cameras, no press, not yet. Julian didn't need them here. This wasn't for the public. This part was for the system. The part that had watched things break 1,000 times before and done nothing. As they moved through the hallway, staff turned to look. Some recognized him instantly. Some only recognized the weight he carried in his silence. Either way, no one stopped them. They passed a display of Etheria's Equity and Excellence campaign on a glossy acrylic sign, still fresh from last quarter's marketing push. Julian paused for the briefest moment in front of it. He tilted his head. Words always looked different when they'd just been contradicted. A junior staffer tried to smile at him as he passed. He didn't return it. This wasn't a time for false peace. They reached the secured elevator. Marina pressed her badge to the scanner. The doors opened. Inside the lift. Naomi spoke first. "We have full analysis of their public materials from the last 3 years' DEI reports, public diversity claims, compliance statements. There's a canyon between what they say and what they've done." Julian nodded. "And now," Naomi added, "we're giving them a chance to answer for it." He looked at his reflection in the elevator mirror, calm, controlled, but behind his eyes, something deeper burned. He didn't want revenge. He wanted clarity. He wanted them to look directly at what they had done and realize it wasn't a mistake. It was a culture, and he wasn't asking them to change. He was requiring it. The elevator opened onto the executive floor. Etheria's boardroom stood at the far end, floor-to-ceiling glass. Skyline view, long, polished table. He entered without waiting to be announced. Inside, 12 people sat in tense silence. Suits, ties, designer scarves, PR leads, CFO, chief legal, chief operations, and at the head of the table, Richard Hanover, CEO. He stood as Julian entered, Mr. Mercer. Hanover began. "Thank you for coming in on such short." Julian didn't stop walking. He placed his leather folio at the center of the table. "I'm not here for thanks," he said. "I'm here for facts." The words landed like a gavel. Hanover sat back down, slowly. Naomi took a seat beside Julian. Marina remained standing, tablet in hand, screen active. Julian opened the folio. "This," he said, "is not an isolated incident." He tapped the first tab. The room's main screen lit up with a paused image. Darla Reese, standing stiffly at seat 1A, Julian seated, looking up, Connor Maddox beside her, Sloane Harrington in the aisle. The frozen moment before it all unraveled. No matter how politely it was delivered, Julian said, this was not professionalism, it was discrimination dressed in uniform. He clicked again. Next slide. A list of previous passenger complaints citing unequal treatment on Etheria flights. Names blurred for privacy, dates clear, racial descriptions noted by witnesses. Naomi leaned in. 3 of those include language eerily similar to what Mr. Mercer was told. Variations of, "This seat isn't for you." A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Julian continued. "This," he said, "is your culture's reflection. You don't need a new slogan. You need a reckoning." Hanover opened his mouth to speak, but Julian raised a hand. Another click. The screen changed again. Footage of Sloane Harrington caught mid-motion slipping something into Connor Maddox's jacket pocket. Silence. Utter, perfect silence. Attempted bribery. Naomi said quietly, "Under FAA guidelines, this qualifies as grounds for federal inquiry." A board member whispered, "Jesus." Julian didn't flinch. "Let's stop pretending this is about discomfort," he said. "Let's stop calling racism an incident and start calling it what it is, an institutional vulnerability." He tapped the table, "And if you don't fix it, your company won't survive the next 30 days. Hanover leaned forward. "We're already moving to review the incident." "No," Julian said. "You don't review what's already been exposed. You respond to it." He looked around the room. "Your market value dropped 6% this morning. Legal teams from 2 partner brands have contacted Marina. Advertisers are pulling placements, and you've lost the trust of the most valuable demographic in modern air travel professionals of color who no longer believe they're safe in your seats." He opened one final file. "This is the proposal. 5 points, clear, specific, uncompromising. 1. Termination of Darla Reese and Connor Maddox, effective immediately. 2. Lifetime flight ban on Sloane Harrington and official reporting of her actions to federal authorities. 3. Full public apology admitting systemic failure, not just a customer service error. 4. 48-hour suspension of all domestic Etheria flights to conduct equity and ethics training. 5. Immediate implementation of Omnisite's passenger equity monitoring platform with full access granted to third-party auditing bodies." The room was frozen. The PR lead opened their mouth, closed it again. Hanover swallowed hard. "You understand what this will cost us," he said. Julian stood. "You're asking the wrong question." He looked out the glass wall behind them, to the tarmac, where planes were lined like dominoes. The real question is, what will it cost you if you don't? And with that, he turned and left the boardroom. Marina followed. Naomi stayed behind to formalize terms. As the doors closed behind him, Julian exhaled for the first time in hours. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt necessary, because this was never about Seat 1A. This was about every seat after it, every seat where someone felt like they didn't belong, and every moment where silence had protected those who should have known better. That era ended today, and Julian Mercer didn't need to shout. He just needed them to listen. The news didn't break like a scream. It spread like a pulse. Steady, measured, inevitable. By 9:45 a.m., internal emails at Etheria Airlines were already circulating. Confidential memos marked priority executive review. Only carried subject lines that began with phrases like compliance issue, contract exposure, and, most alarmingly, shareholder activation clause invoked. Julian Mercer hadn't waited for the board's consensus. He didn't need to. His leverage, built over years of quiet positioning, meant that his signature alone was enough to place the $75 million systems contract with Etheria on indefinite hold. And more importantly, his voting block tied to Omnisite and several aligned tech investors was enough to trigger Clause B17.5 emergency governance oversight. It wasn't a threat. It was a mechanism, one built for moments exactly like this. Downstairs, employees in public relations worked in near silence, eyes glued to news alerts that pinged every 3 seconds. The video of the in-flight removal had now reached over 6 million views. 3 different late-night hosts had already posted reaction tweets. Civil rights organizations had begun tagging Etheria's main account, demanding formal accountability, and trending globally across every major platform one phrase, Seat 1A. It had become more than a seat number. It was a symbol, a shorthand for every subtle exclusion, every silent judgment, every time someone had been told, "You don't belong," without the words being spoken aloud. By 10:00 a.m., Richard Hanover was on the phone with the chairman of the board. "I don't think we can spin this," he said, his voice low, taut with fatigue. "We can't frame it as a misunderstanding. The footage shows everything: tone, body language, escalation, and the bribe. Confirmed, clear enough. Slipped into Maddox's pocket right before the removal. Julian has the original file, and the contract suspended indefinitely, and he's preparing a full statement. We have maybe an hour." The chairman sighed. "Then we vote, and we comply." Hanover closed his eyes for a moment, then hung up. It was happening. Not just a course correction, a corporate gutting. He turned to his chief of staff. "Get the department heads. We have 40 minutes to prepare the largest operational pause in this airline's history." Upstairs, Marina Shu reviewed documents one last time, flanked by 2 aides and Naomi Reyes. Julian sat at the end of the table, not speaking. He didn't need to. Everything was already in motion. Naomi flipped to the next page of the agreement. The terms are set. Legal binding acknowledgement from Etheria of misconduct. All employee suspensions to begin at midnight tonight. Mandatory attendance for 100% of flight and cabin crew over a 48-hour period. Julian nodded, and training modules finalized and reviewed by external DEI experts and civil rights auditors. Every session recorded, monitored by third-party agencies. Marina added, "We've booked 5 conference centers in 5 cities. Simultaneous rollout. First time in airline industry history. Julian looked up. They'll call it a stunt. They already are, Naomi said. The real question is what you'll call it. Julian leaned back. I'll call it a start. At exactly 11:58 a.m., Etherea's official social media account released a 5-part statement. It read like a confession. They acknowledged a deep failure in upholding the dignity of all passengers. They confirmed systemic shortcomings exacerbated by poor judgment at the crew level. They announced the termination of Darla Reese and Connor Maddox and the permanent suspension of Ms. Sloan Harrington from all affiliated flights, and then, in a line that stunned even the most cynical readers to reset our values, all Etheria operations will pause for 48 hours, beginning midnight tonight, to engage in mandatory internal restructuring and equity-centered retraining. We are not stepping away from responsibility, we are stepping toward it. The comment section exploded. Some praised the action, others mocked it, but no one ignored it, because no one had ever seen it before. In an industry built on speed, pausing everything was unthinkable, but Julian knew something most didn't. Sometimes, to move forward, you had to stop everything that was quietly hurting people. By noon, the board had voted, and by 12:10 internal communications confirmed the halt. Flight crews were rerouted to training centers. Operations managers began scheduling blackout periods. Flight announcements were modified with temporary scripts that acknowledged the pause and its purpose. One captain, preparing for his last pre-suspension flight to Dallas, stood at the front of the cabin and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be taking off momentarily. You may hear more about what's happening inside Etheria today. All I can say is we're doing something most don't. We're listening." At corporate, Julian remained seated as messages came in. Industry analysts chimed in on cable news, calling the decision financially risky but morally unprecedented. A university professor tweeted, "We're watching the end of the old airline model and the beginning of something more human." And one passenger, a young black woman, posted a selfie in Coach, tagging Etheria with the caption, "For the first time in my life, I don't feel like I have to prove I belong in my seat. Thank you, Mr. Mercer." Seat. Julian read the post twice. Then again, he didn't smile, but something inside him settled. Not pride, not satisfaction, just stillness, like the wind had stopped fighting him for once. Marina looked over from her phone. "You're trending, again." Julian exhaled. Let the trend do the work. We have more to build. Naomi stood. This next week will be brutal. Backlash, lawsuits, internal resistance. Julian nodded. Then we keep showing up. With clarity, with truth, with data. He looked around the room. We're not fixing an airline. He paused. We're unlearning a habit. A silence followed, thick, weighty, not uncomfortable, just real. And for the first time since he'd been told to move out of seat 1A, Julian felt what he hadn't allowed himself to feel yet. Hope, not that everything was better, but that something had started. Something bigger than the seat. Something that might finally reach the cockpit, the gate, the boardroom, and the back row of every plane in America. Because if truth could travel this far in one morning, then maybe, just maybe, justice could fly too. At precisely 12:01 a.m., every aircraft in Etheria Airlines' global network was grounded. Not for weather, not for technical failure, but by design. From San Francisco to Boston, Munich to Johannesburg, gate agents began delivering the same unusual script to thousands of passengers. Good evening. We regret to inform you that Etheria has temporarily suspended all flight operations for internal restructuring and retraining. We apologize for the disruption and thank you for your understanding as we take a necessary pause to serve you better in the future. Some passengers blinked, confused, others angry, a few, reading the headlines on their phones, simply nodded. In a quiet corner of Phoenix Sky Harbor, a mother with 2 children looked up from her phone, then down at the sleeping toddler in her lap. She whispered, "About time someone took this seriously." On the other side of the country, at Etheria's JFK Crew Center, over 400 employees gathered in silence, uniforms crisp, faces wary, not because they had been reprimanded, but because none of them had ever seen anything like this. A pilot leaned over to a flight attendant and said, "Do we even know what this is?" She answered without looking up, "It's accountability. By 6:00 a.m., 5 regional training hubs had been activated in Denver, Atlanta, Newark, Dallas, and Los Angeles. Hundreds of flight attendants, ground crews, pilots, and executives sat together in conference halls under a bold white banner, Equity in Action, Etheria's Cultural Reset. Julian Mercer wasn't on a stage. He was in the crowd, not just watching, but witnessing. At the Los Angeles site, the largest of the 5, over 600 employees had gathered in a former aircraft hangar repurposed into a massive workshop space. Rows of chairs faced several large projection screens, flanked by breakout session signs, bias recognition, passenger safety versus prejudice, active allyship in the air. Julian stood near the back. He didn't wear a suit today. No need. Today wasn't about posturing. It was about presence. A facilitator stepped up to the mic. Her voice was warm but firm. "Good morning, everyone. We want to start by saying you're not here to be blamed. You're here because we believe you're part of the solution." There was a pause, a shift. You could feel it. Walls coming down just slightly. And then the lights dimmed. The first video module began. It wasn't a corporate training video. No actors, no stock music. It was real. Footage from the incident on Flight 309 played in full, uninterrupted, unedited. You could hear Julian's voice. "I will not move. This is my assigned seat." You could hear Darla's tone. "We'd hate to escalate this, sir." You could hear the passenger murmur, and you could feel the silence as security escorted Julian off the plane. In the back row, a flight attendant named Melissa swallowed hard. She remembered the flight. She had worked in the economy cabin that day. She hadn't known what happened in first class until hours later, when she saw it trending on her layover. Now, seeing it play again on this scale hit differently. At the end of the video, the screen faded to black. Then a single sentence appeared, "What does silence cost?" No one spoke for a moment, and then the facilitator returned. "We're not here to punish anyone. We're here to ask better questions." In breakout rooms, conversations started slow, but not quiet. Some employees shared stories of things they'd seen. Bias brushed off as policy. Angry passengers handled differently depending on their appearance. Internal warnings ignored. Others were less ready, some defensive, some hurt, but something rare was happening. People were listening, not for a chance to respond, but to understand. Julian sat in on one session where a baggage handler named Luis shared his experience. "I've worked 20 years in this industry. I don't deal with passengers directly. But even I've been pulled aside when I try to fly on my own time, like I don't belong up there, like I'm not part of this." He hesitated. "Truth is, a lot of us have let stuff slide, not because we're okay with it, but because we didn't think we could stop it." Julian nodded. "You weren't wrong to be afraid," he said, "but you're not powerless now." Someone across the room, an older pilot with salt and pepper hair, raised a hand. "I've flown for 31 years. I've watched people get upgraded because they look the part, while others get questioned twice. I should have said something. I didn't." Julian met his eyes. "Now you can." By midday, it wasn't just training, it was transformation. No loud speeches, no guilt-ridden drama, just people finally given space to speak, finally asked to reflect, finally told, "You have the right to challenge what's broken." Melissa approached Julian during lunch. "I'm not high up," she said, "just a flight attendant." Julian shook his head. "Don't say just. You have one of the most visible jobs in this company. Your choices matter." Her eyes welled. "I saw a lot that day, but I didn't speak up. I didn't know if it was my place." Julian smiled gently. "Let me be clear. It's always your place to protect dignity. That's the job now, for all of us." She nodded, and in that nod, he saw something shift. Not guilt. Ownership. That afternoon, a new training module was introduced, Omnisight's Passenger Equity Monitoring System. A live demo showed how the system would now analyze passenger interactions across all flights, flagging patterns in seating conflicts, service discrepancies, and escalations tied to identity. Supervisors would no longer have final say. Independent equity officers rotating between departments would review flagged cases, not to accuse, but to ensure fairness. Julian watched the demo quietly. Some employees looked stunned, others looked relieved. Finally, someone else would be watching, the right way, and not just when the cameras were rolling. By 5:00 p.m., the day's sessions concluded, but no one rushed out. Many stayed in their seats, talking in small circles, replaying what they'd learned. Julian walked through the hangar slowly, hands in his pockets. He didn't speak, but he didn't have to. He had already said what needed saying. Now, the silence wasn't heavy, it wasn't loaded, it was something else. Reflection. And, for the first time, perhaps in Etheria's entire corporate history, the most powerful sound wasn't an engine roar, it was a pause, a moment, a decision, to stop, to listen, to change. The sun rose slow and quiet over the second day of Etheria's historic shutdown. No engines, no calls for boarding, no jet bridges moving like clockwork. Instead, in 5 cities. The halls were full again, not with passengers, but with people unlearning habits, undoing silence, and facing truths many had spent years trying not to name. In Los Angeles, the largest training site, employees filed in more willingly than the day before. No one wore uniforms this time. They wore their regular clothes, some in jeans, some still crisp in slacks, others in faded polos from long overnight flights. Julian Mercer walked in just before the first session began. Today, he didn't stand near the back. He sat near the middle, visible, approachable, and still, unmistakably, the reason they were all here. A new video module played this time, not about Julian's experience, but about the broader pattern. Clips and stories from other passengers. One Latina woman describing how she was asked to show her boarding pass twice while white passengers weren't. A Sikh man recounting how he was told to remove his turban in front of a full gate for safety. A mother of 3 in tears as she shared how a flight attendant refused to let her move to an empty row despite her toddler crying, only to allow a business traveler to stretch out moments later. None of these passengers were famous, but they were all seen now, and that visibility was beginning to ripple inside the room. Melissa, the flight attendant who had worked economy on Julian's flight, sat 2 rows behind him. She hadn't spoken yesterday beyond her brief one-on-one, but something inside her had shifted. Today, she raised her hand and stood. "I want to say something," she said, voice quiet at first, then steady. "When I saw Mr. Mercer walk off that flight, I felt sick because I knew. I didn't know what had happened in first class, but I knew deep down I hadn't done anything to stop it." The room was still. She took a breath. "But I'm tired of that feeling, of the pit in my stomach every time I pretend I didn't notice something unfair. I want to do better. I will do better, and not just when people are watching." A few heads nodded. Julian turned slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. He nodded once. Melissa exhaled and sat. In that single act of speaking, she had crossed a line many never dared to approach, not between right and wrong, but between silence and responsibility. Elsewhere in the room, a veteran pilot named Captain Ron Mathers shifted in his seat. He was in his early 60s, white, dignified, usually quiet. He had flown with Etheria for over 35 years. He'd watched the company evolve on the surface. But today, something gnawed at him. During a small group breakout, he stood unexpectedly. "I've flown every aircraft in this company. I've worked with good people. I've trained hundreds, and I've also stayed quiet." He looked at the facilitator, then at the floor. "I remember being on a flight where a black woman in first class was asked if she was sure she'd purchased the ticket. I said nothing. I just kept reading my checklist. It wasn't my crew. I told myself that." He looked up again, but it was my company, my cockpit, my silence. No one clapped. No one needed to. What he said sat heavy and real, and maybe, finally, freeing. Back in Etheria's New York headquarters, CEO Richard Hanover stared out the 33rd floor window. The city below looked the same as always, busy, beautiful, impatient. But inside the room, something had changed. He was sitting in a closed-door session with Julian Mercer and Naomi Reyes. No PR team, no script, no press, just 3 people and the cost of a truth too long buried. Julian had been quiet for most of the meeting, letting Naomi speak. Now, he leaned forward. "I'm not here for an apology." Hanover looked up. "I assumed that," he said, voice low. Julian nodded. "You should have called this meeting 10 years ago, not because of what happened to me, but because it's been happening, quietly, systemically, consistently, and you built a company that never asked why." Hanover didn't argue. He didn't deflect. He didn't defend. For once, he listened, and Julian went on. "This pause, it's not the finish line. It's not a redemption arc. It's a beginning. And it only works if the leadership stops thinking damage control is the same thing as cultural repair," Naomi added. "We need to formalize what started. Policy is fragile. Culture is built by what we institutionalize." She slid a document across the table. "The Passenger Equity Assurance Protocol PEAP, a permanent addition to Etheria's bylaws. Every flight crew, gate agent, and supervisor would be required to undergo annual equity certification. A dedicated internal equity officer would report independently of HR. A third-party review board would oversee complaints not just assess, but correct, and Julian's OmniSite system would monitor patterns not to punish, but to prevent. Hanover picked up the pen and signed. No statement, no handshake, just ink and intention. Back in Los Angeles, as the day's training wound down, employees gathered around food tables and informal discussion areas. The conversations were different now. Not surface level. Not just how long have you worked here or what's your usual route. People were talking about choices, memories, moments that lingered in the mind long after a flight had landed. Julian walked past a group of younger flight attendants laughing not at anything inappropriate, but with relief, as if something heavy had finally been named. He smiled, and then someone called his name. It was Captain Mathers. He extended a hand. Julian shook it. "I've been part of this company since before it merged with 3 others," the captain said. "I've seen it get faster, more global, more digital." He paused, "But not always better," Julian replied. "Now's the chance." Mathers nodded, "And I don't want to waste it." That evening, as the lights dimmed in the training center, Julian stayed behind. He sat alone in the empty room for a moment, letting it all settle. Not the victory, not the headlines, just the quiet. The same quiet he'd once been forced to walk through alone. Now, it was shared, and in that sharing, the change had already begun. Day 3 began before the sun rose. In the quiet stillness of the ethereal Los Angeles Training Center, janitorial staff moved through the aisles, rearranging chairs, resetting tables, preparing for what would be the final full day of the airline's unprecedented pause. The sky outside was still dark, but inside, something had shifted. This wasn't a corporate program anymore. It had become personal. The sessions scheduled for today were deeper, not just about equity or customer treatment. Today was about reckoning with stories, histories, silences that had never been invited into boardrooms or break rooms. At 7:30 a.m., Julian Mercer arrived earlier than usual. He wasn't alone. With him was Simone Carter, a 29-year-old gate agent from Atlanta who had reached out the night before through Naomi Reyes. Her email had been short, hesitant, but it struck something in Julian immediately. "I was there when something similar happened 3 years ago. I never said anything. I'm ready now." Simone walked in beside him. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady. Inside the main hall, employees were already gathering. The energy was different, quieter, focused, a little raw. Julian stepped to the front, not to command attention, but to introduce someone who deserved it. "I want you to hear from someone who saw what I didn't," he said into the mic, "because this isn't about me. It never was. This is about patterns, choices, and finally, about voices." He stepped aside. Simone stood at the mic, voice soft but unwavering. 3 years ago, I was working Gate 12 at Atlanta International. It was a busy morning. A black woman, mid-40s, traveling solo, came to the counter with a first-class boarding pass. She smiled, gave her ID. I scanned her in. She paused, but then my supervisor came over, whispered in my ear, said, "Double-check that. She doesn't look like she flies first." A few people in the room inhaled sharply. Simone kept going. I didn't say anything. I just did what I was told. I asked her for her ID again, her boarding pass again. She looked confused, hurt. She handed them back to me. I checked again. Everything was fine. I told her she could board. Another pause, but the damage was done. I saw it in her face, and I didn't stop it. I followed a bias I didn't create, but I didn't challenge it either. Simone's voice caught, but she didn't stop. I think about her all the time. How small she looked walking down the jet bridge. How much power I gave away just by being silent. Julian was still. So was the room. One by one, heads nodded. Simone stepped back. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She stood taller than when she arrived. Later that morning, the final training session began. It was different from the others. Not slides, not policy briefings, no graphs or audits. Instead, 5 seats were placed at the front of the room, a makeshift panel. Each seat filled by someone from a different department, a flight attendant, a pilot, a gate agent, a supervisor, and one passenger advocate. Julian took the last seat. The idea was simple speak from where you've been. Share without fear. One by one, they told their stories. The pilot, a biracial woman named Kara, shared how she had once been denied entry into a cockpit by a fellow employee during a routine inspection. The supervisor, a white man named Dean, shared how he once reassigned a seat based on comfort levels expressed by a frequent flyer, only later realizing what he'd justified. The advocate, a soft-spoken man named Malik who had worked in Etheria's complaint resolution department, admitted that most flagged issues involving racial discrimination were quietly deprioritized. It wasn't personal, Malik said, but maybe that's the problem. It should have been, finally. Julian spoke. He didn't talk about the flight. He didn't mention Seat 1A. He talked about being 12 years old, traveling with his mother, and watching a gate agent explain that there must be a mistake on their tickets. They told us to wait. Other passengers boarded. No one looked at us. No one said anything. They just watched us stand there. He paused, and I remember my mother telling me, later that night in a motel off the freeway, always be the person who makes them check again. Never be the one who watches quietly. He looked around. I forgot that lesson for a long time, until that morning. The room held its breath. Then applause, not loud, but full, warm, grounded. It didn't feel like closure. It felt like opening. That afternoon, the operations team began preparing for the airline's return to service. But this time, it wasn't just flight plans being reviewed. It was people. People signing new behavior agreements, people volunteering to mentor others, people asking to be held accountable not just today, but going forward. In the hallway near the rear exit, Melissa found Julian once again. "I think I'm going to apply for the internal equity liaison role," she said. Julian looked surprised, then smiled. "You should—" She nodded. "I used to think my job was to make passengers comfortable. Now I think it's to make them feel safe. There's a difference." Julian held her gaze. "There is, in another wing of the building." Simone stood quietly with Naomi, signing a consent form to speak publicly on a future panel. "I don't want to be anonymous anymore," she said. "I want to be useful." "You already are," Naomi said. By the time the final session ended at 6:30 p.m., people didn't rush to the parking lots. They lingered. They exchanged numbers. They promised things: to speak, to stand up, to notice, to unlearn. Julian sat outside on a bench under the softening sky. He hadn't said much during the second half of the day. He didn't need to. He had seen what he came for. Not a perfect transformation, but a beginning. The start of something harder and more important than a policy shift, culture, real change. Beneath the bench, his phone vibrated. It was a message from Richard Hanover. The board has voted to make the passenger equity protocol a permanent fixture in our charter. You were right. It had to be earned. Julian read the message once, then again, and finally he allowed himself to exhale, not in triumph, but in release. 3 days ago, they had tried to remove him from his seat. Tonight, he had helped rebuild the foundation under every seat that would ever follow. And tomorrow, Etheria would fly again. But this time, it wouldn't just be in the sky. It would be towards something better. The terminals were quiet in a way that didn't feel normal, not eerie, but expectant. It was 4:42 a.m. on the fourth morning. At Gate 17B in Dallas, the jet bridge hissed softly as the first inbound Etheria flight since the suspension prepared to receive its boarding call. Agents moved with intention, but no rush. Pilots arrived early. Cabin crew double-checked everything, not just the seating chart or the coffee count, but each other. Everyone ready asked Kara, the same pilot who had spoken during the final day of training. Her co-pilot, a younger man named Ravi, nodded. I think so, but I won't lie. It feels different. It should, she said. Over the last 72 hours, words like feels different had meant something. They didn't mean fear. They meant awareness, the kind that stayed with you even after the conference room lights went off. At the boarding gate, the new announcement script was ready. It wasn't dramatic, but it was intentional. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Etheria Flight 402 to Portland. As we return to full service, we thank you for your patience and for allowing us the time to become better for you and for one another. Some passengers raised eyebrows. Others offered small nods. One woman near the back, traveling alone with a carry-on and a worn paperback, smiled gently. No one asked why. Back on board. Melissa adjusted her uniform collar. It sat differently now, not just on her shoulders, but in her sense of purpose. Her badge still read flight attendant, but to her it now meant something more. Protector, witness, equalizer. A young black teenager in row 3 smiled as she passed by. Melissa paused, then smiled back, not out of formality, out of solidarity. In row 7, a man traveling in business attire called her over. He had an impatient look, tight mouth, sharp eyebrows. I pre-selected a window seat, he said. Someone's already in it. Melissa leaned in. Voice calm. Of course. Let me check. She walked toward the row. An older Asian woman sat quietly in the window seat. Her posture was small, but her eyes were wide and alert. Melissa asked, softly, "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" The woman handed it over, a slight tremor in her hand. Melissa read it. The window seat was correct. She returned to the businessman. Her seat is correctly assigned. She said, "You may have selected a preference, but it looks like you were placed in the aisle for this flight." The man looked frustrated. Melissa didn't flinch. "If you'd like, I can check with the gate if any other windows are available, but she is not required to move." He opened his mouth to push again, then stopped and nodded. Back in the jump seat, Kara glanced down the cabin. She didn't need to hear the interaction. She saw it, and something about it told her they were doing it. Not perfectly, but they were doing it. In Portland. Simone Carter stood behind the check-in desk for Flight 891, preparing to board passengers for the first time since the shutdown. Her heart raced, not from nerves, but from the weight of choosing not to disappear. She had thought about backing out. After speaking at the panel, her inbox had filled with messages, some supportive, others not. One even told her to stay in her lane, but this was her lane, and she wasn't leaving it. The first boarding call was routine. Then a young mother approached. Black, with 2 kids under 7. Her ticket showed 2 economy seats and 1 seat marked "Gate Assigned." Simone smiled gently. One moment. She checked the system. There was 1 open seat aisle, 4 rows ahead of the others. She paused. Then she paged the lead gate agent. "We're going to move someone else to that solo seat," she said. "Keep this family together." The other agent raised a brow. "Are you sure that other seat's technically better?" Simone met her eyes. "I'm sure." A few moments later, the mother's eyes welled with relief. "Thank you," she said, voice low. Simone didn't need to reply. She just scanned the tickets and nodded them through, and she knew this was what change felt like. Not headlines, not applause, just someone feeling safe without needing to ask. Mid-air, Flight 402 had settled into its rhythm. The lights dimmed, passengers dozed in the galley. Melissa poured herself a cup of tea. Her hands were steady now. Julian's words echoed in her mind. Comfort is not the goal. Dignity is. She turned as another attendant. James stepped into the galley. "You handled that seat thing well," he said. Melissa shrugged. "It wasn't that hard." "No," he said, pausing. "But a month ago, we probably would have let him have it." "You know," Melissa nodded, and James added, "I used to think professional meant not getting involved. Now I think it means knowing when you have to." Melissa raised her cup to knowing better. He clinked his with hers, to doing better, in New York, inside Etheria's executive floor. Richard Hanover sat at his desk reviewing an updated report from the Passenger Equity Assurance Platform. The dashboard pulsed with live metrics, incident alerts, flagged behavior, satisfaction curves broken down by race, gender, language. It wasn't perfect, but it was transparent. Naomi Reyes appeared in the doorway. "The first 12 hours are in," she said. "Not a single equity-related flag requiring escalation." "Not bad," he replied. "Not bad," she agreed. Then she added, "But it'll only stay that way if this isn't a moment." Hanover nodded. "We'll make sure it's not." She lingered a second longer. "You really signed it in ink," she said. "I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't either." "But you did." He looked out the window, because someone refused to be moved in Los Angeles. Julian Mercer watched the final report from his Omnisite team scroll across the screen. The data told a story. No raised voices, no forced removals, no arbitrary seat reassignments. But it was a smaller note at the bottom that caught his eye. Passenger feedback trending positive. Several comments citing improved sense of respect and attentiveness. That mattered. But something else mattered more. He clicked a message in his inbox. It was from the young black teen on Flight 402, a photo of her journal. In it, she'd written, "He changed something. I don't know what exactly, but today, I felt like I was allowed to take up space." Julian read it 3 times. He didn't reply, but he bookmarked it and saved it, because that was the seat that had always mattered most. Flight 227 was cruising at 30,000 feet, en route from Chicago to San Diego. The cabin was calm, The seatbelt sign was off. Passengers had slipped into the rhythm of the flight, quiet conversations, tablets glowing, drinks arriving one cart at a time. In seat 4C, Julian Mercer sat reading, not an e-book, not a company report, a novel, something about a detective in Detroit, gritty and layered. The kind of story with complicated truth and no clean endings. His kind of story. A flight attendant offered him a coffee refill. He accepted with a polite nod. Everything felt normal, uneventful, until it wasn't. Halfway through the flight, a minor turbulence warning came over the speaker. The seatbelt light blinked. Nothing dramatic, but the real disturbance was in row 2. "I don't want her sitting next to me," came a voice. It was loud, sharp, unapologetic. Julian's eyes lifted from the page. He could hear it clearly. Everyone could. A white woman in her 50s, diamond studs, red blazer, turned in her seat and pointed at the woman beside her. A younger South Asian passenger in a modest blouse and jeans. "I requested a window seat without anyone sitting beside me. This isn't acceptable." The flight attendant arrived, clearly unsettled. "Ma'am, the flight is full. All seats are assigned." "Well, then move her somewhere else," the woman snapped. "I don't care where." The younger woman shrunk into herself. She didn't speak. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, clutching a book she hadn't opened since boarding. Julian closed his novel. His instincts were split. Wait, watch step in, or let the crew handle it. He stayed still, listening. The flight attendant's voice softened. "Ma'am, this seat was properly assigned. Unless another passenger volunteers to switch, I can't. You can and you will." The woman interrupted. "Don't make me escalate." The threat was clear. Julian turned, met the eyes of the woman being targeted. She didn't look surprised, just tired, like she'd been through this before. The flight attendant stepped back. Julian stood, walked up slowly, not to confront, to observe. Directly. "Everything all right here?" he asked. The red blazer woman's eyes snapped toward him. "This doesn't concern you," she snapped. Julian looked at the younger woman. "Miss, are you all right?" She nodded faintly, but didn't speak. Julian turned to the flight attendant. "I'd like to speak to the cabin lead. Please." "I am the lead," said a voice behind him. A tall, well-groomed man approached from the front of the cabin, blazer crisp, eyes uncertain. Julian recognized the hesitation. He had seen it 100 times before. Leadership untested, policy versus pressure. The cabin lead spoke quietly. "Mr. Mercer, I can assure you we're trying to manage this without escalation." Julian nodded slowly. "You don't manage injustice. You correct it." The words landed with weight. The red blazer woman crossed her arms. "Oh, please, don't lecture me. I pay for comfort, and I expect it." Julian kept his voice calm. "Your comfort doesn't come at the cost of someone else's dignity." Silence. Tense. Tight. The cabin lead shifted his stance, then said something no one expected. "Ma'am." He turned to the red blazer woman. "You may keep your seat or choose another if one becomes available, but you do not get to choose who sits beside you, not based on preference, and certainly not based on appearance." She blinked, as if slapped. "You'll regret this," she hissed. Julian looked at the younger woman. "Would you like to move?" She shook her head. "Then you stay," he said gently. He turned and walked back to his seat. The lead followed quietly. Before Julian sat, he said, "Thank you." The cabin lead nodded. "I meant it," he said. "This is different now. We don't just protect passengers, we protect policy that protects them." Julian's reply was simple. "Good." The flight resumed. The red blazer woman sat stiffly for the next hour, but she didn't speak again, and the younger woman eventually opened her book, read a few pages, then smiled, not at anyone in particular, just to herself, maybe because for once she hadn't been forced to shrink. In the cockpit, Captain Kara received a written report from the lead. She reviewed it carefully, then signed it. Behavior flag recorded. A formal follow-up marked for compliance review. 6 months ago, it would have been forgotten by the time the wheels hit the tarmac. Not today. Today, it would be logged, reviewed, tracked, and, if needed, corrected. Back in New York, Naomi Reyes sat in a small meeting room across from Richard Hanover, reviewing incident summaries. One of them had just come through, Flight 227, minor disruption, no reassignment, policy upheld. Naomi looked up. That one could have gone wrong. Hanover nodded, but it didn't. She watched him for a moment. "You do realize the most dangerous part of change isn't when you announce it. It's when people try to undo it quietly." "I do, because they will." "I know. Are you ready?" Hanover didn't answer right away. Then he did. "With help, yes." Naomi smiled. "That's enough for now." Later that evening, Julian deplaned at San Diego International. He walked without rush, carry-on in hand. At the gate exit, someone tapped his shoulder. It was the young woman from Seat 2B. She looked nervous, but her voice was clear. "I just wanted to say thank you." Julian nodded. "You shouldn't have to." "I know," she said, "but I do anyway." She hesitated, then added, "I used to fly with my father. He always told me if something feels wrong on a plane, stay quiet, don't cause trouble, don't make yourself noticeable." She looked away. "Today, I didn't have to choose between being safe and being seen." Julian didn't reply right away. He didn't need to. She walked away into the crowd, but her words stayed with him. That night, in his hotel room, Julian opened his laptop. Etheria's flight dashboard glowed across the screen. Data flowed charts, metrics, alerts. Flight 207's report was already processed. He opened the file, read the notes. One sentence stood out: "Crew enforced equity policy despite passenger resistance. Incident de-escalated without displacement. No silence observed." Julian leaned back. That last line, that was everything. No silence observed. Not today, not anymore. It was raining in Seattle when Julian Mercer arrived at the Etheria Equity Learning Center. The building stood just beyond the outskirts of the main airport campus, repurposed from a retired hangar. Once cold, industrial space, it had been transformed into something human: clean lines, warm lights, high ceilings. Glass panels allowed natural light to flood the wide atrium when skies were clear. Today, the clouds pressed low and gray, but the center still felt bright. Julian entered without ceremony. No press, no ribbon cutting. He was here to observe, to listen. Marina met him in the front corridor. She handed him a visitor pass and walked with him quietly through the entryway. "They don't know you're coming," she said. Julian nodded. "That's how I prefer it." The hum of voices echoed from deeper inside. He passed a wall of portraits, faces of employees from every department: flight attendants, baggage handlers, desk agents, pilots, engineers. Beneath each photo, a quote. One read, "I used to think silence was safety. Now I know it's just distance. Another said I didn't stop caring. I stopped thinking I mattered. Now I know I do. Julian paused. Marina watched him carefully. You inspired this, she said. He shook his head. They did the work, he said. I just refused to stay quiet. Inside the main training hall, a session was underway. About 40 new employees sat in staggered rows, uniforms crisp, expressions curious. On the screen at the front was a paused video. It wasn't the infamous flight recording. It was dramatized footage, a reconstruction. Julian recognized it. The moment when the seat was questioned, when the voice said, "Sir, this seat isn't meant for people like you." But this time, it wasn't about outrage. It was about understanding. The instructor stepped forward. What did you feel watching that scene? She asked the group. Silence at first. Then a young man raised his hand. I felt embarrassed, he said, that I wouldn't have spoken up. I don't know if I would have. A woman added, I felt like I'd seen it before. Maybe not exactly, but in tone, yes. The instructor nodded. And how do we respond, not with guilt, but with growth? Another hand. We lean into the discomfort. We name it. We use the policy not to protect the company, but to protect people. Julian felt something shift in his chest. Not pride. Something deeper. Relief. One of the trainees, young, black, early 20s, stood up and said, My uncle was a gate agent for 30 years. He told me stories. He used to say, what's right doesn't always have a procedure. Now it does. A ripple moved through the room. Julian stepped back, just outside the doorway, giving them their space. He didn't need to be the center of this. It wasn't about him anymore. Later, he visited the storytelling lab, an interactive space where employees could share experiences anonymously. Each wall was filled with post-it notes, recordings, short essays, some handwritten, some typed, some raw. One said, I once switched a black passenger from a seat up front to make room for a preferred flyer. I told myself it was about loyalty status. It wasn't. I knew it then. I'm sorry. I'm doing better now. Another said simply, Thank you for reminding me I can speak. In a small side room, a woman named Priya ran a session for team leads. They were reviewing actual complaints from the past month, not to assign blame, but to detect patterns. A few cases stood out. One involved a Spanish-speaking family being overlooked for assistance. Another, a passenger in a wheelchair left waiting on the tarmac. Each story was mapped, each mistake examined, but not with shame, with purpose. Priya asked, What could we have done differently? And no one deflected. They answered, with honesty. Julian stood in the corner, hands in his pockets, listening. He saw something forming in that room, not a checklist, not a reaction, a blueprint. That night, he sat with Marina and Naomi in a quiet cafe near the University District. Over herbal tea and candlelight, they reflected. You realize, Naomi said, this is the first time in my career I've seen corporate reform that wasn't purely reputational. Marina added, You gave them structure, but they gave it soul. Julian smiled. I think we all gave it time. He stirred his tea. I used to believe progress was a destination, he said. Now, I think it's just a way of walking, a pace, a decision not to go backward. Marina leaned forward. You still get angry? He nodded, but not in the way I used to. He said, I don't burn, I build. Outside, the rain was still falling. But inside that little cafe, it felt like something was healing. The next morning, before his flight out, Julian returned to the Learning Center one last time. In the entry hallway, a new plaque had been installed. He hadn't seen it before. It read, "For the ones who didn't surrender their seat and the ones who won't surrender their voice." There was no name on the plaque, no attribution. It didn't need one. Julian touched the edge gently. He didn't smile. He simply breathed. The center would continue its work. Flights would still take off. Mistakes would still happen. But so would course correction. So would truth. So would change. And somewhere out there, someone else, someone unknown, unseen, would be told they didn't belong. And someone would answer, quietly but firmly, "Yes, they do." And that would be enough. That was a legacy. That was the work. The boarding process for Flight 606 to Boston was nearly complete. At Gate 32, Julian Mercer stood quietly by the window, sipping water from a paper cup. Outside, the sun was rising over the tarmac. Light spilled across the jet bridge, softening the cold lines of concrete and steel. He watched as the last few passengers stepped through the boarding door. No cameras, no press, just ordinary travelers starting their day. It felt like the right way to end this chapter, not with applause, but with quiet resolve. An agent approached him. "Mr. Mercer, we're ready for you to board. Seat 1A. Julian smiled. "Thank you." As he walked toward the jet bridge, he passed a row of gate monitors. One was cycling through airline announcements. A new tagline flashed briefly before fading into a destination board. "Belonging isn't a perk, it's policy." He paused to read it twice. It wasn't just a slogan anymore. It was a standard, boarding the aircraft. Julian offered a polite nod to the cabin crew, who welcomed him warmly. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Mercer. Let us know if there's anything we can do." He settled into 1A. The seat was wide, clean, comfortable, but it wasn't the comfort that moved him. It was the fact that this time no one questioned whether he belonged there. As the plane taxied, Julian looked out over the runway and reflected on how far things had come and how far they still needed to go. A knock on the partition caught his attention. A woman in uniform, late 30s, approached. "Excuse me, Mr. Mercer. My name's Sophia. I'm the purser on today's flight. I wanted to thank you." Julian looked up. Curious, Sophia's voice lowered just a little. "I was a trainee during the first wave of equity training," she said. "We watched the simulation of what happened to you. We studied it. We talked about it for hours. At first, it made me angry. Not at you, at the fact that I hadn't realized how many times I'd stood by and done nothing." Julian nodded. Sophia added, "But it also gave me language, and now I teach that same training to new recruits. I just wanted you to know, you didn't just change things for passengers. You changed things for us, too." He held her gaze. "Thank you for telling me that." She smiled and returned to the galley. As the engines roared and the plane lifted from the runway, Julian let himself relax into the ascent. 30 minutes into the flight, he took out a leather notebook from his carry-on, the same notebook he had carried for years. Inside were handwritten thoughts, sketches of ideas, names of people who'd shared their stories. He flipped to a blank page and wrote, "Dignity doesn't ask for permission. It remembers its own worth." He sat with the sentence for a moment. Then he turned to the window. Clouds rolled beneath them like a quiet ocean. There had been a time when the sky felt like a battleground. Now it felt like ground reclaimed. Later, during the flight, A young girl about 8 or 9 passed by his seat on her way to the restroom. She glanced at him, hesitated, then pointed. "Are you the man from the video?" Julian smiled gently. "I might be." She stepped closer. "My teacher showed it in class. We had a whole discussion about fairness afterward. Some kids didn't get it, but I did." He tilted his head. "What did you get?" She said that being quiet doesn't make you safe. It just makes the unfair stuff quieter. Julian chuckled. "That's very wise." She shrugged, as if embarrassed, then whispered, "My big brother's training to be a pilot. I want to be a gate agent someday, so I can help people feel welcome." "You'd be great at it," Julian said. The girl beamed, then scampered back down the aisle. The rest of the flight passed smoothly. When they landed in Boston, Julian was among the last to disembark. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, he caught sight of a framed photo on the wall beside the exit. It wasn't of him. It was a collage: employees helping passengers, crews embracing, a family reunited. Beneath it, a simple inscription: "Every seat has a story. Make yours worth sitting in." Outside, the city was alive with morning motion, taxis, trains, people crossing streets. Julian took a deep breath. It wasn't over. There would still be moments of regression. Still people who didn't understand. Still systems that required vigilance. But something was undeniably different now. A shift had begun, not loud, not easy, but real. He turned on his phone and saw a new message waiting from Naomi. Subject: Passenger Equity Protocol ratified in 4 additional airlines. He smiled. Another ripple. He replied simply, "Keep it moving," then slipped the phone into his coat pocket. As he stepped into the rhythm of the crowd, he no longer felt like an outsider. Not because people suddenly treated him differently, but because he had reclaimed the space he had always belonged in, and helped others do the same. Somewhere, on another flight, someone else would face a quiet test. Someone would be told directly or indirectly that they didn't belong. And someone else, maybe a young crew member trained under the new system, maybe a fellow passenger, would say they do. And in that small, unrecorded moment, everything would shift again. Because change is never just about the past. It's about the next choice, and the next one after that. Julian Mercer didn't seek fame. He never asked for headlines. He only asked that his seat, his presence, his worth be seen. And because he refused to surrender, an entire industry finally started to look inward. It all began at 30,000 feet. It began with the seat, but it never stopped there. Not anymore. Not ever again. Julian Mercer never raised his voice. He never cursed, never threatened, never begged. And yet he grounded an entire airline. Because sometimes justice doesn't wear a cape. It wears a quiet stare, a calm voice, and an unwavering belief that dignity is not negotiable. What began with one man being told he didn't belong became a movement that rewrote the rules of how we treat each other on planes, in companies, in silence, and in truth. And while the faces of those who wronged him faded into scandal and consequence, the face that remained was one of grace, strength, and courage. Let this story be a reminder. Discrimination doesn't always shout at whispers in policies, smiles in uniform, and hides in traditions. But so does resistance. And when resistance looks like you, like me, like any one of us, change is no longer impossible. If this story moved you, if it made you feel seen, if it made you think, don't keep it to yourself, like, share, subscribe, because the fight for fairness isn't over. And the next time someone says, "You don't belong here," you'll know exactly how wrong they are. See you in the next story. Until then, keep standing.